Slide, NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series. Investment Funding 2, Engaging with Investors. March 8, 2022. NIH, National Institute on Aging. A woman appears in a video call at the top right corner of the slideshow. Text, Monique Larocque.
I welcome you to the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneurship Workshop Series, Investment Funding 2. This is a part 2 of our series, and we are focused today on engaging with investors.
Slide, about the Entrepreneur Workshop Series, a bullet point list.
So this has been a long partnership with the National Institute on Aging, as well as the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Our goal is to really offer research entrepreneurs and biotech small businesses expert guidance and opportunity to dig in and ask questions and to learn the key components of startup success. We have been doing these sessions from 2021 and now concluding in 2022. And we have a really rich series. So if you weren't able to join all of them, but you're interested in the topics, and I'll show some of the topics soon, you can go to the NIA Small Business Program archived events page. And that link is also included in the chat, and we'll send it to you as a follow-up thank you to this webinar. I do want to also let you know about an exciting opportunity. There is an opportunity for you to do a one-on-one conversations. If you are an NIA or NHLBI SBIR awardee, you can connect with entrepreneurship experts and set up those meetings and get specific coaching opportunities.
Slide, workshop format, a bullet point list.
Today, we will do a brief overview and then we'll dig into our expert panel. We're going to focus on raising money, positioning and leveraging your value, and negotiating and structuring the deal. We'll also have a brief moderated Q&A. I also wanted to share that we took a lot of the questions that you all sent to us and tried to include them into the presentation. So you'll maybe hearing some of those answers in that way as well. If you do have an additional question, please use the Q&A feature, and we're showing a little diagram of that. It's shown at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and then you'll be able to send your questions to us.
Slide, panelists, names and titles with pictures.
And now I would like to welcome and thank our esteemed panelists. Today we'll have Diane Ignar. Dr. Ignar is the entrepreneur in residence at the National Institute on Aging at NIH. We also have John Reinhart, also an entrepreneur in residence at the National Institute on Aging at NIH. Dr. Stephen Flaim, entrepreneur in residence at NHLBI. And I'm your moderator, Monique Larocque.
Slide, raising money from investors, Steve Flaim, PhD, FACC, FAHA.
And with that, Dr. Flaim, please take it on.
Thanks, Monique. Well, it's really great to be here today. Let me start off by just saying a few words about myself. I'm a cardiovascular physiologist by training. I spent the first 10 years of my career in academic research in a medical school and got recruited over to a large pharmaceutical company on the East Coast, stayed in that sector for about 10 years doing drug discovery. Then I moved to the West Coast and spent the next basically 20 years doing early stage companies and startup companies, some of which I did on my own. And about 10 or 11 years ago, I engaged with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute to help them with their commercialization efforts on SBIR and STTR funded companies. And so I come to you with as a result of that relationship. In addition, I should point out that about 20 years ago, I joined the Tech Coast Angels, which is a Southern California organized angel investor group. And through that relationship, I got a lot of experience with investing in early stage companies. I'm also a former board of directors members for the Angel Capital Association. So I have those background, I speak to you with all of those background experiences under my belt. So let's go to the next slide.
Slide, agenda, a bullet point list.
What I'd like to do today is touch on these sort of topics. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about capital sources for entrepreneurs. Secondly, I'm going to focus my discussion mostly on angel investing and how to find angel investors, the risk-reward relationship that angels have to deal with when they consider investments, and then what angel investors consider to be fundable companies. So let's go to the next slide.
Slide, why raise money? Positives and negatives, 2 bullet point lists.
So why raise money? A lot of entrepreneurs would prefer not to do that, but most of them have to do that. And the reason is you don't have the personal resources in most cases to actually fund your own startup company. A lot of entrepreneurs also recognize that they need advice and counsel, and the folks that invest in them are committed investors, and most of them also have experienced business activities, and so they can be actually good advisors and supporters of the company. Entrepreneurs need money to grow faster than they would if they just tried to invest their own money. And finally, investors help entrepreneurs gain access to a network of partners, clients, and potentially employees as the company grows. Now, there are negative sides to accepting investment money. The most important one is you lose complete control of your company. Investors will want a share of your equity, and therefore they will own part of your company. You also tend to lose control over time because the board of directors usually becomes an independent board. Lots of times early stage companies start off with 3 board members, all of them are insiders. And as investors get involved, they kind of insist that the board becomes independent because it's a more supportive board and provides a more objective approach to the company. Investors need an exit. They need to get their money back. It's not a philanthropic effort. They are looking for a return on their investment. And so that tends to fly in the face of what entrepreneurs want sometimes. So you have to realize that if you're taking money from an investor, it's like getting married. You've got a partner and you've got to work with that partner going forward. So next slide.
Slide. Financing sources over startup lifecycle, a table.
This slide is complicated. Let me go through it. Going across the top, you see sectors in the slide. So idea, innovation, prototype, introduction, growth, and maturity. These are different stages of a startup company. And the vertical axis, cash from revenues, is basically what the company is doing in terms of earning money. So it starts out, if you look at the thick blue line, it starts out at 0, which is the break-even point. It's actually the 0 line on cash from revenues. And as you can see, as the company goes from proof of concept over to early stage, they are basically losing money. They're spending money, they're not earning money. And it's about the point between introduction and growth where the company starts to gain revenue and actually starts earning money. Now, sprinkled through the center of this graphic, I also should point out that early stage, those first 2 or 3 sectors over on the left side are what we frequently call the valley of death. And this is the area where many companies fail, and this is where companies need investment. So sprinkled through the center of the graphic are where the investors and where the sources of funding come from. So in the proof of concept and pre-seed stage, extending into the seed and startup stage, you see entrepreneurs raising money from accelerators, crowdfunding sources, government sources such as Phase 1, SBIR, STTR, and also friends and family. And then as you move from pre-seed to seed and startup, you also see more government sources, Phase 2, SBIR, STTR, and then you see engagement of angel investors. And those investors take the company generally to an early stage. They're still not revenue positive. And then it's at that point where the handoff occurs to venture capital investors and potentially strategic investors. And it's those investor groups that then take the company forward, ultimately getting out to maturity, and the company might do an IPO in initial public offering, which is basically funded in many cases by banking organizations. So that's the financial sources over the life cycle of a startup. And let's move on to the next slide.
Slide. Investment models, a bullet point list.
So I just want to say a few words about investment models. And let me start off by saying that most investors will not invest in companies that are limited liability corporations, so LLCs. Investors don't want common stock. What they want are preferred shares and the ownership of a C Corp. So if you're an LLC and you're looking for investment, you're not going to get traction. You need to convert to a C Corp. It's not complicated, but you need to do it. The C Corp gives investors a preference on control and some return from the investment. They get a voice on the board. They help control the company and contribute to it, and it also protects their downside to some extent. Now, there's also something called convertible debt. These are investment vehicles that are basically debt. They're loans that go to the company. There are several different kinds. There's one called a SAFE. There's also a KISS. These are versions of convertible debt loans. And these convert to preferred shares at the next round of a company's fundraising. Just generally, some terms to consider: the typical convertible debt note has about an 8% annual interest. That interest is paid to the investor through stock as opposed to cash. And the other important point is that when the company does do a conversion to an equity round, there must be prospectively a cap on the valuation of the company. If there's no cap on the valuation of the company, the early stage investors can be very badly diluted if the next round of investment is at a very high valuation. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Slide. Venture capital investors, 25 to 50 billion annually, a bullet point list.
Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about venture capital investors. Let me begin by saying that VCs invest annually in the United States somewhere between 25 and $50 billion a year. That's billion with a B. These are funds that are aggregated from multiple investor groups or individuals. They could be hedge funds, retirement accounts, and so forth. They're money that's put into a fund, and then that fund is managed by individuals that are called venture partners. So the venture partners actually do the investing, but they're not investing their own money. They're investing somebody else's money. And they invest the money in portfolio companies. A typical VC investment is in the range of $3 to $8 million in a round of $10 million or more. And this is usually done as a syndication of 2 or 3 or more VCs coming together. VCs tend to invest in later stage companies. They are looking for an exit from the company in about 5 years, and they're seeking about a 15x or more return on their investment. VCs recognize the importance of follow-on investment rounds, and they will, if they're willing to invest in you the first round, they're likely to be willing to put in additional funding around the second and third rounds as well. VCs tend to invest in companies whose pre-money value is around $10 million or more. And pre-money value is very important to VCs as well as other investors. So how do you find venture capital investors? One way to do it is to go to the VC website. Most VC funds have a website, and they list their portfolio companies on their website. And what this does is it allows you to look at the kinds of companies that they've invested in, and it gives you some inkling as to whether or not they might be interested in your company or your technology. So for example, if you go to a VC website and you don't see any life science or healthcare investing companies in their portfolio, you can pretty much bet they're not going to be interested in a life science or healthcare company. You can also go to a company who you know has already received investment that might be similar to your company or in your technology sector. Most companies that have websites will list the investors that have invested in them. And so you can go to those company websites and see the investors, and many of them are VCs. And then you know that those VCs have invested in that type of company. So that's one way. Another way to find VCs is through networking. And you can do this going to meetings, a variety of different ways, talking to people. Networking is extremely important. And I will say that warm introductions to a venture capital firm is usually required. If you just send an email or try to phone a VC firm without a warm introduction, you're probably not going to be very successful. So it takes a lot of work behind the scenes to make those connections. The other thing you can do is go to the National Venture Capital Association website, the NVCA, and it's shown there. And I think they're going to put it up on the in the chat. And this website will give you some inkling of basically all the VCs are members of the NVCA, and you can get a sense of who they are, find their websites, and take a look at what kind of investments they've made. Let's go to the next slide.
Slide, strategic investors, a bullet point list.
Now I want to say a few words about strategic investors. This is another class of investors, and these are generally established companies that have some kind of strategic interest in your company or your technology. So they are companies that are seeking development partnerships or rights to a technology. They may want to acquire your company if your technology gets developed to the proper stage. They will provide funds and which will help help you move your technology forward. Obviously, with some stipulation that they will have maybe first right of refusal to the technology or the company at some point in the future. The stage of development of your company and the pre-money value of your company is less important to strategic investors than it is to venture capital investors, simply because they're not so interested in those issues. They're more interested in getting the technology developed and taking it on. The relevant strategic investor for your technology is probably going to be one that has a marketed product that's relevant to your area. They might be active in a particular field, or they may have a strategic reason to invest in you. Some of them might be good reasons and some not so good, but they have a reason to want to be associated with your startup. A lot of major strategics companies have incubator or innovation programs that they've put together. So an example of this is J Labs, which is an incubator innovation program that was established some years ago by Johnson & Johnson Corporation. And so they bring in early stage companies, they incubate them in their incubators and help them move forward, and then obviously would have some kind of first right of refusal. And so you can look at strategics that are in your sector and see if they have an incubator and apply to get involved in that incubator. Another point that's important here is that many of these companies send what we call prospectors out to science and business meetings looking for candidate technologies and candidate companies that they might want to acquire. And so if you go to a science or a business meeting, bring your business cards and be prepared to talk to anybody that comes up to you, because you don't know whether they're a prospector or not. And finally, pitch competitions occur at national science meetings and at business meetings, and these things are going on all the time. And you can attend those meetings and be in the audience and meet people, network there. A lot of times these strategics have these prospectors and they're sitting in the audience, and you can meet a lot of people that way and do a lot of active networking. You can also apply to pitch and you get your technology presented in the meeting, and that would also obviously give you the kind of showcase and recognition that you might need. All right, let's go on to the next slide.
Slide. Who are these angels? Angel investors, 25 to 30 billion annually, a bullet point list.
I want to now focus on the angel investing sector. So angel investors as a group, believe it or not, invest about the same amount, 25 to 30 billion dollars a year in the United States annually. It's roughly the same amount of money that venture capital investors invest. So it's a very significant amount of money, and it occurs every year. Who are these people? Well, they're wealthy individuals that invest their personal funds. They usually are working part-time, or maybe they're fully retired, and they're interested in supporting early stage companies and potentially getting a return on their investment. They often invest as a group. So there's organized angel groups, such as the one that I belong to here in Southern California called Tech Coast Angels. They invest not only their time, but they invest, they invest not only their money, but they invest their time. So unlike venture firms, angel investors tend to support companies through advice, support of various types, and they really get involved in the early stage companies and support their portfolio. The typical angel investment is for a single person is about a check for $25,000. And this goes into, along with others, into a round of about $750,000. That is the typical angel investment. Obviously, the round can vary from 200,000. I've seen rounds as much as $1.5 million from angel investors. So there's a lot of variability there. Angels tend to invest in seed and startup companies, but they will invest in later stage companies as well. But the predominant investment is in seed and startup. Angel investors, like venture firms, understand that the companies are going to need a follow-on investment. And so many, if not most, of the companies that angel investors get involved with at early stage come back to those investors for a second, maybe even a third round of investment. Angels, like VCs, have a strong interest in an exit strategy. So they want to know how they're going to get their total investment back with a multiple, and how are you going to exit them from the investment. Next slide.
Slide. How to find angel investors. A screenshot from a website.
So a lot of people wonder, how do you find angel investors? And I'm going to tell you the easiest way to do it is this way. Go to the Angel Capital Association website, www.angelcapitalassociation.org. I think they put it in the chat. And if you go there, this is a screenshot of the outward facing screen, and you can see there's a blue button there, a square that's called, it says Find Angels. Thank you. And if you push that button, go to the next slide, please. It will take you to this screen.
Slide. A screenshot of a web page titled ACA Member Directory.
And the thing I want you to focus on is the table at the bottom. Now, this is just the top of the table, but what it shows is the group name on the left. And then if you go across, it says the state or the province where the group is, the region of the group, and then over on the far right, it gives the website of the group. Now, you can go to region and you can sort for, so for example, 757 Angels Inc. is Mid-Atlantic. So that's anywhere from probably Delaware down to North Carolina, roughly, that region. And you can sort for all the Mid-Atlantic angel groups. And then what you can do then is look at the angel groups that are in your region, go to their website and see the kinds of investments that they make. Now, the reason region is important is that traditionally, angels and angel groups like to invest in companies that are in their neck of the woods. This is less important now than it used to be because of the pandemic. And so we're all meeting by Zoom and looking at deals across the country. But I would say that if you, the best way to start is to find an angel investor in your region or an angel investor group in your region that will invest in your type of technology and reach out to them first. And if you can get them engaged, then they can help you find other groups that will also be interested. Let's go to the next slide.
Slide. Risk versus reward.
I want to talk a little bit about risk versus reward for angels. So next slide, please.
Slide. Return to angels, a bullet point list.
So angels need a return. The early stage company investments that we're talking about are high risk investments, and they deserve a high return. And a high return is something like 20% per year. So how do you get to that? So 20% per year is about 2.5x multiple of capital invested over a period of 5 years. And in general, angel groups achieve this goal, but you've got to realize that half of all angel-funded startups fail to return any capital at all. 9 out of 10 fail to return the capital that was invested in the 10. And finally, all the upside comes from 1 in 10 investments. So in order to achieve a 2.5 multiple return within a portfolio, 1 in 10 investments must be a 25x return. And this assumes that all others fail, which is a bit pessimistic. So we see a lot of maybe 1.5x, 2x, but overall angel investors are looking for that kind of return to be convinced to invest. And one of the most important aspects of an investment for an angel investor is that the company must have a technology that has the potential to scale. Next slide.
Slide. Lessons learned, a bullet point list.
So what angels have learned over time is that, yeah, returns can be good, but half of all investments do fail. And so in order to overcome this massive failure rate, they have to invest in a portfolio of companies with many companies involved, and each investment must demonstrate a significant possibility for an opportunity to scale. And then another key bit of information that is always surprising to people is that there really is no relationship between risk and scalability. So returns that have a potential scalability of 3x fail about as frequently as software companies, startups that have a potential for a 30x return. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next slide.
Slide. Entrepreneur considerations, a bullet point list.
From the entrepreneur's point of view, here are things that you need to think about. So angels must, in order to convince an angel to invest in your company, the angel must be convinced that they will get 10x return in about 3 to 5 years from your investment. The typical investment for an angel is a syndicated round of $1 million. The pre-money value of the company that they're investing in is probably about $3 million. And the post-money would then be, say, $4 million. And under those circumstances, the angels as a group would own about 25% of your company. So founders are diluted, but in exchange for this dilution, you have cash to work with. It's invested at high risk, and you also have valuable advice and experience from these experienced investors. Next slide.
Slide. Angels' perspective on fundable companies.
So let's talk about angels' perspectives on fundable companies. Next slide.
Slide. Non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, a bullet point list.
So what are they looking for? So before we actually get to that, I want to say a couple of words about non-disclosure agreements. So most investors, angels and VCs, will not sign NDAs. The reason is that they see too many deals, they get totally bogged down with NDAs, and they just can't do it. Integrity is extremely important in this business. If they breached a secrecy agreement or a secrecy with the company, they would not be able to do their business. They're really not motivated to steal technology. They're just trying to understand the technology in the company to determine whether they want to invest. There are some circumstances where an NDA may be signed. This does happen once in a while when you're deep in due diligence and there may be some key bit of highly confidential information that's important for the investors to know about, but you really can't disclose it to the entire group. One of the members of the due diligence team can sign an NDA and then report back to the group, yes, I looked at the technology and I think it's really good, or it's not so good, or whatever. And then they can represent the secret material to the group without disclosing the details. So I always end up by just saying, when I talk about NDAs, when you send out a business plan, whether it be a pitch deck or a business plan of any type, do not include proprietary information. That's especially very critically secret information. Don't include it in there. You can talk about it with appropriate individuals, but don't include it in your pitch deck or your business plan. Next slide.
Slide. Angel rating system, a bar graph.
So angels rate companies that they're considering to invest in based on these 5 or 6 issues. So the most important issue for an investor is the management team. So that gets the highest rating, most important feature of a company. The second is the size of the opportunity. Then it's the product and technology. Then the competitive environment for that technology. And then whether or not there are sales channels and marketing opportunities in place. And finally, the need for more funding. So you can see that the thing I want to emphasize here is the management team is the most important feature that is attractive or not attractive to investors. Next slide.
Slide. Fundable management teams, a bullet point list.
So let's talk about some of these features. So in terms of management teams, the CEO needs to be coachable. This is extremely important. What that means is the CEO needs to be able to sit down with the investor, and the investor might suggest something to the CEO, and the CEO needs to listen to that and indicate that he recognizes that there's value in that suggestion. If the CEO is not coachable, the investors are not going to be interested. The CEO has to have integrity. Ideally, the CEO has some experience that's relevant to this company or this type of situation, and they have leadership skills. Ideally, they have experience in the technology vertical as well. And then the team members need to be identified, and maybe not all on board yet, but they need to be there. And the team needs to be balanced and approaching some level of completion, with the top members of the C-suite sort of identified and ready to engage. And ideally, that team has experience working together. So these are, this is what a fundable management team looks like. Next slide.
Slide. Size of the opportunity, a bullet point list.
So the size of the opportunity is extremely important as well. It needs to be scalable, as I said before. This means that you need to be able to see $20 million revenue, say within 5 years of investment. This is not necessarily true for all kinds of technologies. Some of the drug discovery technologies take longer, but generally speaking, that's the kind of revenue that we're looking for. Venture capital investors look for a higher revenue. They're looking more for $100 million in 5 years. So you can tell that they're going to be looking for more well-developed companies than angels are willing to invest in. There needs to be a large niche market that's identified that can achieve high revenues, and ideally with minimum competition. And then the gross margins need to be in place as well. Ideally, the growth can occur with internally generated cash. And what this does is it allows the company to grow with less investment capital in the downstream. Next slide.
Slide. Product and technology, a bullet point list.
The product and technology needs to be developed to a point where it's available for customer validation. So a prototype, if it's a device, some sort of beta test situation, it needs to be available. Ideally, the technology is unique. With some kind of IP protection either established or underway. And the manufacturability of the technology in quantity needs to be validated and understood, and a plan kind of needs to be in place for that. Next slide.
Slide. Intellectual property, a bullet point list.
In terms of intellectual property, this can be patents, trademarks, trade secrets. This competitive advantage must exist for angel investors, and I think for VCs as well, and in fact for strategics as well. You need to be in a situation where competing companies that have a lot of resources can't just come in and reverse engineer your product and then compete with you. And one thing I do want to point out here is that IP, like patents, don't really bring a lot of value to a startup, but they do have, and the reason for that is that startups really don't have the finances to defend against legal challenges to the IP. So where intellectual property becomes valuable is at the exit. So acquiring companies will insist on solid intellectual property, and this IP then adds great value at the exit. So ultimately, the early stage investors will benefit from that. Next slide.
Slide. Marketing and sales, a bullet point list.
In terms of marketing and sales, ideally, there's some kind of customer validation that's available. The investors will want to verify that those customers exist, and this is really an essential to getting an investment from an investor. Ideally, there's marketing and branding issues already having been addressed or in the process of being addressed. There needs to be some kind of reasonable sales channels that are at least contemplated or even defined. And ideally, some kind of partnerships established. If that's the case, that brings a lot of value to a startup. And then the competitive advantage needs to be identified. And so you need to be able to compete against smaller competitors in a fractured marketplace. Next slide.
Slide. Summary, a bullet point list. Text, contact, Stephen F. Flaim, Ph.D., FLAIMSF at NHLBI.nih.gov.
So I'm going to summarize here some of the important things that I've said. So first of all, the importance of private capital for early stage companies is clear. Early stage investors will invest in C Corps and other types of models for private capital investors. We talked about how to find a venture investor and strategics and angel investors. We talked about the risk reward and the need for founder dilution in exchange for this early stage high risk money. The typical angel deal is $150,000 to maybe $1 million total at a $2 to $5 million pre-money value. And the angel's perspective on fundable companies are, basically a highly qualified team, large and scalable market. Product technology has an unfair competitive advantage, keeping others from competing in your space. And finally, customer validation needs to be in place. And my contact information is up there in the top right. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diane and John and Diane, and they're going to talk about positioning and leveraging your value. Thank you.
Slide, positioning and leveraging your value. Diane Ignar, PhD, RPH.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure the audience found it useful. So I'm just going to start off, and then John's going to, I think, finish up the workshop for today. A few words about myself. I was a neuroscientist by training, spent most of my career at GlaxoSmithKline, spanning basic biology through clinical development and business development, and have been in the biotech sector over the last several years. Founded and operated Austria Bio, and have been enjoying being an entrepreneur in residence at NIA, helping companies move forward. If we can go to the next slide.
Slide, positioning and leveraging your value, 4 bullet point lists.
I think you'll recognize the topics on this slide as the critical elements of a business plan. And it's essential that you develop these facets of your plan fully, because they form the basis of the company value and the strength of your negotiating position. So first, key value proposition elements. You're, bringing to life the burning platform. What is the problem you're trying to solve? You're making sure your solution is understood and its application to the problem is understood by investors, and the reason to believe it will work. As far as evidence of value of your solution, part of that is reason to believe, so your scientific and or clinical data, but also collecting voice of customer feedback where it's helpful. And this could be from physicians, payers, patients, to say that this is a product that we really need. This is why we need it. This is how we'll use it. That's really powerful information if you can collect that. And then if you're a service company having existing contracts, or if your company has license agreements, I think it shows that you have a viable business. So these are all types of value, evidence of value of your solution. There may be others, but this is an area where you really need to show, where the value of your company is. And in the bottom left, competitive advantage. I often see when I work with companies that this area, this is a topic that isn't really developed. And it is critical that you have a deep understanding of the competition that matters to your solution. And in addition to that, you need to be able to clearly articulate why you are differentiated from all of those competitors, if you can, to the best of your ability. And as I say, on the product attributes that really matter, that really bring value. So it's very important that you work on developing your competitive advantage. And then finally, knowing your market and being able to position your product. How is your product going to be first to market? Is it going to be coming in to a market where there are already competitors, but your product has a better profile? And why does it have a better profile? So I think all of this together, you need to be able to articulate to investors. If we can go to the next slide, please.
Slide, negotiations, a bullet point list.
I wanted to say a few words about negotiations. And if you have the opportunity to get some training in negotiations, I would highly recommend that. I had the opportunity to do that at Wharton with a professional negotiator, and it really helped tremendously. It totally changed the way that I viewed negotiations. And I've given the definition here as a strategic discussion that resolves an issue in a way that both parties find acceptable. And so this gets to a lot of the points that Steve was making, that you need to be thinking about the other party. I mean, the companies know what they would like to have as far as investment and how much equity they'd like to keep, and thinking about what the company wants. But it's actually critical that you think about what the investor wants. Respect what they bring to the table, and listen, try to bring out of that party what they most want and care about, because sometimes you might be able to give them that without affecting your own position. So understanding what the other party needs so that you can work to a win-win is critical in negotiations. I also, in the first bullet, negotiations do start with the first conversation. So you might think, oh, it's just a first conversation. It doesn't really matter what we say here. I've heard that before. And actually, I sat on the business development side in pharma, and we would remember anything we were told. First conversation, second conversation, and we would bring it up later. So it's very important that every conversation you have, you need to prepare for. And you need to think about the messages and what you're sharing with that potential investor or partner. When you're preparing, it's very important that if you have more than one person entering into a negotiation, that your team prepares for the negotiation together, that you have a strategy, who is going to say what, making sure you're all on the same page, because I have negotiated with biotechs where within that biotech, their negotiations started falling apart because they were disagreeing with each other. This is deadly to a negotiation. So you really need to prepare with your team, make sure everybody's in lockstep. And I think that the team has to agree to what may be your walk away point. What can you absolutely not accept? And it's really important to define that. And you need to stick to it. And frankly, I have seen teams walk away, and then negotiation starts again for various reasons. So, but it's important because if you are so invested in getting the deal done, then it puts you in a weaker position because you're not willing to walk away. You're not willing to go look for another investor. And maybe you're in a situation where you are in a weak negotiating position, but hopefully that's not the case. And finally, I'll just say that it's really important to maintain integrity and credibility, as Steve was saying. And I'll just give a very brief example where at a high level, where a company shared information about their costs, and we were able to obtain information that showed that those costs were inflated. And so through the rest of the negotiation, they've lost trust. We didn't know whether or not we could continue to trust what they were telling us because they had already had that kind of a misstep. So it's really important to make sure that your data is solid, that it's put together correctly, there aren't any mistakes, so that you always maintain your best face. But in the end, I think that the most important point here is think about the other party, what they need, what they want, and respect what they're bringing to the table, because it's not just money, it's connections and potentially your next round of investors. And it is going to be a partnership. So how you treat each other during the negotiation actually does affect the future working relationship. So now I'm going to turn it over to John.
Slide, deal structure and terms, a bullet point list. John Reinhart, CPA, MBA.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to finish this up. I have 3 slides. They're tactical slides about the elements of deal structure and the term sheet. My background, I'm a health entrepreneur, but a serial entrepreneur. I've been in digital health, age tech, and specifically around senior living and the aging, what they call the longevity economy. I'm a CPA and an MBA in healthcare, and I am a EIR. I complement Diane with the NIA team, and I really enjoy it also. But anyway, we're going to give you, from everything that becomes part of the negotiation to everything that you do, from meeting angels and meeting investors in general, it's all verbal till it comes down to the time to get an agreement. And if whatever you've done verbally and whatever you've discussed needs to be memorialized in the basic framework of what's going to be an agreement. So the first point I'd like to make is the term sheet is not a binding agreement, but it does start memorializing the basic terms and conditions of an investment. So it is an offer to be into a memorialized contract. That is very different to some extent from a signed LOI or memo of understanding, but all three of them outline the framework of the deal. But as Diane and I know, and Steve knows also, that sometimes the nuances between agreeing on the major framework and then what's in the actual binding contract can be a lot of different nuances and elements of details that you may want to be familiar with. So what I would tell you is verbal doesn't matter, but written does, and signed and written matters a lot. And that is really what you're going to be living with. But the second thing I would tell you is that it is trust and credibility, because whatever agreement you're going to think you're going to make and whatever partnership you're going to be working, Steve called it a marriage. I like that analogy, but it is going to be a commitment of time and energy in the same mutual direction. And so it has to be a mutual benefit. You do not want to get off to a sort of us versus them or a contradictory relationship at all. And then valuation principles. Everybody worries about valuation, and there is methodologies to valuation. Steve brought up a very good pre-revenue, early stage valuation. They're intrinsics. They're not financials, but financials matter. Revenue, earnings, those all matter. And when you get to later stage companies, there's comparables and there's market comparables of the public market companies to really frame up what the company is worth. Next slide.
Slide. Key elements of a term sheet, a bullet point list.
Let's talk about the rules of the game. So the rules of the game are the elements of the term sheet. And if you don't know or understand the concepts of the term sheet, which all angels do and all VCs do, then you're really at a disadvantage. But to Diane's point, it makes you feel unprepared, but you are unprepared. So I'm going to take you through the high level concepts. First of all, Steve gave us an indication of a pre-money, post-money. So if you get agreed upon what your company's worth today, and Steve used the example of 3 million, and then the investors give you $1 million, that $1 million becomes cash on what was already 3 million. So post-money, the company's now worth 4 million, 3 million plus the new cash, 4 million. If somebody buys a 25% share of a $4 million company, then the shares they're going to equal to is 25% of all outstanding shares on a post-money basis. The type of stock is important. There's two types of stock, common stock and preferred stock. Preferred stock has extra benefits. Sometimes it can have warrants or interest, other things that it earns. But most of the reason for the preference of preferred stock is in liquidation and in rights. And so a preferred shareholder is a special class. They don't vote any differently than common shareholders, but they convert to vote, but they do have special rights and privileges that are only associated with preferred stock. And so everybody votes as a common shareholder, but preferred shareholders could be a separate class. They call it a class of shareholders. And some of the rights are the ones that we're going to follow on down the bottom of this slide. Option pools, nobody wants to bring people into high risk environments with basically living wages, but not fair market value wages without the ability for being part of the company. And so what happens is you set aside a certain amount of stock, not just for investors, but you set aside a certain amount of stock for future employees and key employees. And this brings their package, their economics may not be great in wages, but what this does is it offsets the risk for an employee to become part of something that's bigger and something that has a value that's growing alongside their basic pay. And that's a lot of reasons people will take a lot of risk with a startup company. The liquidation preferences are getting back to that preferred versus common. It's basically the order, if there would be a liquidation of assets, of who would get paid first. And they're usually in order of the shareholders and the classes. And if there's not enough money to cover everybody, then those preferences kick in on the liquidation side. Control provisions, I have another slide specifically about control provisions, but most people think it's the shareholders that control and the voting shares that control, but in a lot of cases, the board is the director and the control of the company, and those are usually positioned to be affiliated with the shares that are owned, but they're also affiliated with the leaders on the board side of the company's control. Participation and pro rata rights. Basically, this means that if there is another investment round, as Steve said, most people consider additional investment rounds, that investors are able to, at the same percentage they are owners of, invest in the next round to keep their participation and to keep their level of ownership at the same percentage. Tag along and drag along rights are if a majority of the shareholders or the majority of the controlling shareholders decide to sell their stock. Tag along rights would mean that if you're a minority shareholder or not in that majority and they're selling, that you can go along and sell your shares too. If it's drag along rights, it means the majority shareholders decide to sell, they're going to take you with them and you're going to sell with them at whatever deal they make. And so in both cases, the minority shareholders are aligned with the majority shareholders in this provision. And this allows the people that have the most ownership of the company to make decisions on exits with everybody being unanimous at the end. Anti-dilutive provisions, particularly focused with preferred shareholders, that basically says if for some reason your valuation of your next round is less than your valuation of the round they came in at, then they get additional shares thus to not be diluted by later investment rounds to what they paid. And so another preferred shareholder right. Next slide.
Slide. Control provisions.
So control provisions, everybody that's a preferred shareholder will convert to common, sometimes in a ratio of more shares than 1-to-1, but everybody votes as a common shareholder in a company. And Steve referred to C Corp. That's the one that uses shares. So a common shareholder is a complete counting of all the holders of record that all are allowed one vote per share. The board structure is really an assignment of the shareholders to governance and independent governance of the company. The suggestions typically are odd numbers, and Steve mentioned 3. Typically they go in odd numbers so they don't ever get locked in an ability not to decide something. The independent viewpoints are very important. Sometimes they'll bring professionals, lawyers, accountants, people that can be leading committees. But most importantly, it does a independent viewpoint and independent expertise to management as well as to the other shareholders' benefit. The investors will demand and typically be given seats related to their investment. And so they will have representation. Founders typically will maintain a seat or seats to protect the integrity of the early mission and vision and the company and where it's heading. And then sometimes management will have a representation. Management could be the founders. In a lot of cases, one of the tips is that the founders will have a separate seat than management. So to the extent that there is a lot of independent viewpoint, you can still maintain some direction with the control provisions of the board. And I've already mentioned that preferred always converts to common to vote, and voting is always 1 share per 1 vote, no matter how big the number of shares are.
Slide. Questions?
With that, I really appreciate everybody participating in the series. I think we have we had a number of questions, but I think we will field some questions. I'll turn it back to Monique, and thank you very much for being part of this with us.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to note that we have included the contacts for our key speakers today in case you have any direct questions that we're not able to get to.
Slide. Connect with NIA. Visit nia.nih.gov/SBIR. Follow us on Twitter at NIA_SBIR. Follow us on LinkedIn, NIA Office of Small Business Research. Questions? Email niasmallbusiness@mail.nih.gov. Slide. Connect with NHLBI. Visit nhlbi.nih.gov/SBIR. Twitter, at NHLBI_SBIR. LinkedIn, National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. Email, nhlbi_SBIR@mail.nih.gov.
But we will walk through a couple here today, and wanted to make sure that if you have anything, you know who to contact and know that we are here for you. With that said, just have a few questions for our colleagues here today. Steve, how do you find investor and strategics that might be interested in my company? Are investor meetings the best way, or should I ask for introductions and contact each company individually?
Yeah, so good question. I think the most, I guess, lucrative way to do this is to actually go to investor meetings where you know that the audience is composed of investors and they're looking at companies that are pitching, seeking investment. And as I mentioned, you can, if you're sitting in the audience and you understand that the technology that's being presented is similar to yours, or there's a bunch of investors there that are interested in your technical area, or whether it be like life science investing, for example, you're in that target-rich environment, and bring a stack of business cards and go around and talk to people. That's probably the best way to go. I do agree that reaching out to individuals, companies, investors, go to those websites that I mentioned and contact the investor groups directly if you can. I think that's also important to do. I think this is one of the hardest parts of doing a startup is identifying investors that might be interested in investing in your company. And as they say in this business, that you've got to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince. So it's a lot of work, and I think you can do all of those things, but I do believe that the target-rich environment is probably the investor conferences.
Thank you. Appreciate the analogy as well. So the next question is for John. Does SBR funding give a company any advantage over non-SBR funded companies, and will investors invest prior to NIH funding?
So that's a great, well, the investors do invest all the time without the SBR funding. The one misnomer is that a dollar invested in the company, whether it be SBR or other kind of grants or awards, is a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's not true. I guess the way I would answer that is SBR funding as a non-dilutive capital source is an excellent leg up for an investor to consider to the company as a viable candidate. But it's what you do with the money and what the outcomes you produce with the grant that ultimately gets to the assessment of the investable business. So don't assume that because you got $2 million in grants that it had $2 million of value, but also if you spent right and you accomplish your goals and get to the level of commercialization using the SBR grant, it is a very attractive investment for outside capital.
Thank you. Steve, can you please discuss how much equity founders should expect to keep and what is fair to give to an investor?
Yeah, so I tried to provide a little bit of information along those lines. I'm going to speak from the standpoint of angel investors. So the typical round of angel, or the typical investment from an angel group, is going to result in the company selling about 20 to 25% of equity to the investors. So it's an early stage, high risk investment, and that's the kind of deal that angels tend to do, and it's the typical thing. So you got to expect to give up that quantity of equity. Ideally, you will then, as an entrepreneur, you'll take that money and you'll invest it in the company, and you'll build the value of the company so that even though you own now 80% of the company the company is now valued much higher than it was at the time you sold that 20%. And so everybody, everybody benefits from that. You get into trouble if you spend the money and you haven't really increased the valuation, then that becomes a problem.
Thank you. Diane, when should you ask a VC to sign an NDA? And you talked about not oversharing. Do you have any tips for that? And the last question is, if the VC agrees to sign the NDA, does that mean that they're serious about investing?
So Steve covered this quite a bit in his section, but I'll simply add that often one of the reasons VCs do not sign an NDA early on is because they may be looking at other companies that are in your space. And so they don't want to sign an NDA until they've decided which company they're most interested in. And so once they get to the point of signing an NDA and starting diligence, I think you can take that as an indicator that they're very interested. And as Steve said, you don't want to share anything that is confidential. And by confidential, you have to define for yourself and think about what is confidential, what is the core of my technology that I cannot share, so that basically I can keep my competitive position. You may find that there's quite a bit you can share non-confidentially when you really think about it. So, but yeah, I think if they're at the point of signing an NDA, that's a good sign.
Thank you. How will the company be received if current operators have full-time roles and are only part-time in the company? At what stage do investors really want to see full-time operators? And that's for John.
Certainly. I think that the point that Steve made about access or commitments, that if the funding is there, the team will come. They're looking for the access to talent, right? So if the talent's not all there in the early stages, I don't think that is not a deal killer, so to speak. But if the talent is not lined up, or we haven't identified the talent or the types of talent, sometimes this is one of the biggest advantages that an angel or a VC network will bring, is access to talent. And they will introduce you. They will say, what's your job description? What are you looking for? In their networks, they will find the right people. A incomplete team without a plan to be complete is a real detriment, but an incomplete team with a plan to be complete is a real good reason to attract capital to complete the team. And I think that becomes, you can make a negative a positive by saying, we have a plan, we know who they are, we have conversations, we have commitments, we need the capital to make it worth the experts' time to join us. I think that's a real positive and a real strong case to make.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone to please fill out the feedback form, as well as to connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Slide. Your feedback matters. A screenshot of a survey. Text. Please open the survey now to complete after the event.
I have one last question. And before I do that, I just wanted to note that the first part of this series does have a lot of answers to some of the questions that we are seeing that go beyond time. You're welcome to look at that archive. You're also welcome to contact us if you would like to email us. We'll include that in the chat as well. If you are an NIA or NHLBI awardee, there's also the offer of the one-on-one meeting.
Slide. Post-presentation one-on-one meetings.
So the next question I'm going to pose to maybe Steve to start, and Diane, you want to add more. But this question relates to due diligence. And if a company is in this process with several investors, how can they streamline the process? And if you have anything else to share about supporting and having an efficient due diligence process, that would be appreciated.
Sure. So first of all, let me say that if you're talking to multiple investors, there's nothing wrong with that, but you got to realize that your first goal is to get a lead investor, and a lead investor is one that will propose a term sheet that you can negotiate and then ultimately hopefully agree upon. Once you've agreed on a term sheet with a lead investor, then you can begin working with that lead investor to identify additional folks that might be interested in participating in the investment, or another word of that is syndication. So it's most important to negotiate a term sheet with the lead, and then let the lead help you identify additional investors. And you can also bring other investors in, but you got to recognize that you must honor that term sheet. You can't negotiate a different term sheet in the same round of investment with a different investor. You've got to stick with that lead investor that you've negotiated your term sheet. And I think the most efficient way to bringing in additional investors is to rely on the lead investor and quickly talk to other investors that you've been speaking with and say, hey, we've got a lead now. Here's the terms. If you're interested, we can put you in touch with the lead investor. Hopefully that answers the question.
And as far as streamlining is concerned, it's very important to start thinking about due diligence from the outside of your company. And the reason is that a lot of due diligence now is online, and so you'll have a data room, and planning that data room from the start will help you versus having to go back and create a data room 2 years into your company. So basically think about your data integrity area, and essentially someone who's doing due diligence needs to track from a graph that you show them all the way back to the original data. So if a pharma due diligence team comes in to look at your data, they're going to be looking all the way potentially to the raw data. I've seen it done. So it's really important to think about, how would somebody track back through my data? How do I formulate my due diligence room? And starting that from the beginning and getting your whole team to do this, basically use the same process, that's going to really help you. And it will also make you look a lot better in the eyes of investors if they come in and do due diligence and you have a beautifully arranged due diligence room. It just shows that the operators of the company are conscientious versus them having to sift through or have a very difficult time getting the diligence done. So it is a really important piece.
And Monique, one thing I'm going to add real quick is, and I've seen this done, and it's a tough one. If you have any verbal agreements with employees or founders or early stage team members, and you don't memorialize them before you get into term sheets and valuations, you could get them into a significant issue with the value of whatever you were intending to give them, equity or options. So you need to make sure that gets cleaned up and memorialized, anything that you have pre-taking capital, so that can get included in the due diligence and be part of the deal, as opposed to being left to the further option plan, which may change the terms of what you're able to do. So just a kind of a lesson learned and seen it happen.
And I'd like to just go back to the NDA for a moment. We talk about NDAs and generalities. If you are sharing confidential information and you do not wish to receive confidential information from the other party, make sure you have a one-way outgoing CDA or NDA. Often you'll be given a mutual NDA to sign, and unless you need to receive CI for confidential information from the other party, it's really best if you're just sharing yours, then a one-way outgoing is the way to go if you don't need the mutual. So.
Thank you, everyone. This has been a fantastic discussion, and we've appreciated everyone who's been with us at the entire series. And if you missed it, again, you can go to our archive page and check out fantastic videos. If you have questions that you would like to discuss or set up a one-on-one meeting, please reach out to the email addresses that we put in chat and that are shown on your screen. We want you to be successful because ultimately we want new innovations helping people and improving health. And so we're here to help you. It's a genuine offer. Feel free to engage with us and connect with our community. Thank you to our guest speakers. We really appreciate your time, attention, and all the effort you put into answering the questions. Thank you, everyone.